The world of late antiquity trembled under the weight of two faiths colliding, the old gods fading into twilight, and a new god rising on a cross. Marble temples, once alive with smoke and music, stood half-ruined, their statues staring blindly toward a future that no longer worshipped them. The air was thick with the scent of incense and fear. In the streets of Rome, whispers spread among priests and philosophers. The age of Jupiter and Venus was dying, and the god of the Christians, invisible, austere, jealous, was claiming the empire's soul. Yet beneath the silence, something refused to die. There were things the church could crush, and there were things it could only bury deep within the memory of mankind. The rituals, the songs, the movements of the flesh, all bound to an older, darker understanding of the sacred. They were not just ceremonies, they were conversations with life itself, with birth, death, and the chaos between. To the early Christians, these rites were obscene, profane, and dangerous, not because they were meaningless, but because they were powerful. Imagine the moment, the last pagan festival on a Roman hilltop. The sun dips low over the Tiber, turning the sky to blood. A priestess of Cybele, her hair matted with oil and myrrh, lifts her arms to the heavens as flutes wail through the dusk. Around her, dancers whirl in frenzy, their bodies painted, their cries echoing through the stones. To them, the body is not sin, it is temple. Pleasure is prayer. The pain of ecstasy is a way to touch the divine. In that hour, they believe the gods walk among them. But just beyond the torchlight, soldiers watch in silence. They have come not to worship, but to end it. The orders are clear: such gatherings are to be dispersed, idols destroyed, priests imprisoned. Within days, the temple will be stripped of its silver, its frescoes whitewashed, its sacred statues broken and repurposed as stones for a new basilica. The transition from the old world to the new will not come with debate, but with erasure. This was not merely a battle of faiths. It was a war for the human soul, for how humanity would define holiness itself. The pagans had celebrated the body as divine expression. The church redefined it as the vessel of temptation. What was once sacred would become sin. What was once life-affirming would be branded as devil's work. And in this redefinition, an entire civilization's memory was rewritten. The question that lingers, and that this story seeks to answer, is why? Why did the church not simply replace the old gods, but seek to erase them? What rituals were so threatening that they had to be scrubbed from history, their details deliberately obscured, their names cursed and forgotten? What was it about these acts, performed in the shadow of the temples, that frightened the men of the cross more than any army or empire? Some historians call it moral reform. Others call it cultural cleansing. But perhaps it was something deeper, the instinct of a new order to silence the language of the body, the pleasure, and the pain that once bound man to the divine. As the centuries passed, the church would rewrite history, replacing the sensual with the spiritual and the pagan with the pious. Yet, in doing so, it would create a ghost, an echo that still calls from beneath the stones of forgotten temples and the ruins beneath every cathedral. This story begins in that haunting silence between the worlds, when the old gods were falling but not yet dead, when priests of the cross whispered prayers over altars still stained with blood and wine, when faith and fear became indistinguishable. In that silence lies a secret that history tried to bury, the rituals so forbidden, so primal, that even today their true nature remains half-erased. What were they hiding? What truth was too dangerous for the church to remember? The answer begins where the memory of the gods ends. Before Christianity remade the ancient world in its image, Rome worshipped through sensation, through blood, through the trembling of flesh and the intoxication of ecstasy. To the pagan mind, the divine was not distant. It pulsed through every living thing. The body was a vessel of revelation, not corruption. When Romans prayed, they did not kneel in silence. They sang, they danced, they bled, and they lost themselves in the rhythm of creation. Their gods demanded not obedience, but participation. They asked humanity to feel divinity, to touch it, taste it, and even suffer for it. This was the world of the old gods, a universe of cycles where death and birth were one, and pleasure was not sin but offering. Among the most ancient were the rites of Cybele, the Great Mother, worshipped across the empire from Phrygia to the heart of Rome. Her priests, the Galli, would dance to exhaustion, their movements wild and frenzied, until the boundary between mortal and divine dissolved. In their ecstasy, they would wound themselves, spilling blood in offering to the goddess who gave life through pain. Some would even castrate themselves in her honor, a terrifying yet sacred act symbolizing complete surrender to her creative and destructive power. To modern eyes, these rituals appear grotesque, almost insane. But to the ancients, they were sacred acts of transformation. The shedding of blood was not mutilation, it was rebirth. The pain of the body opened the gates to the realm of the gods. It was the ultimate declaration that the divine could only be found by transcending the limits of the human form. In that moment of agony and ecstasy, the worshipper believed he became something more than flesh. He became part of the eternal cycle of creation itself. In the mysteries of Dionysus, the god of wine and madness, this idea reached its most fevered expression. In the torchlit forests of Greece and Italy, his followers, men and women alike, would gather in secret to celebrate his sacred frenzy. They called it orgia, a word that has since been twisted to mean debauchery, but originally it meant sacred communion. As drums beat and wine flowed, they danced into trance, shedding their inhibitions, their clothes, their identities. The divine intoxication of Dionysus was not about lust, it was about liberation. In his ecstasy, worshippers felt the collapse of boundaries between man and God, self and other, life and death. There was terror in this liberation. Dionysus himself was both creator and destroyer, the god of the vine that nourishes and the madness that consumes. His worship demanded surrender to the chaos within. And yet, for those who followed him, this chaos was not evil. It was divine truth, that to truly know the gods, one must first lose oneself. The body, the voice, the heartbeat, the trembling hands, all became instruments of revelation. Another cult, that of Isis, the Egyptian mother goddess, offered a gentler but equally profound vision. Her followers believed she held the secrets of resurrection, of eternal love that conquers death. In her temples, worshippers bathed, perfumed themselves, and entered sanctuaries filled with incense and music. They fasted, purified themselves, and participated in dramas reenacting the death and rebirth of her husband Osiris. The initiation into her mysteries was said to be like dying and being reborn, a journey of the soul into divine light. The cult of Isis spread rapidly through the empire, drawing followers with its promise of immortality and intimate connection to a personal goddess. All of these rituals, Cybele's blood, Dionysus's ecstasy, Isis's resurrection, shared one forbidden principle: the divine dwelt in the body. The sacred was not above flesh but within it. The act of worship was not submission, but union, the merging of human and God through experience, sensation, and transformation. This was the theology of the ancient world, one that celebrated the instincts Christianity would later call sinful: pleasure, passion, and the will to live fully within the moment. To early Christians, such beliefs were abominations. The Church Fathers saw in them the work of demons, spirits of deception that trapped humanity in the prison of desire. Augustine, once a follower of pagan philosophy himself, wrote that pleasure chained the soul to corruption. The Church would come to view the human body not as a divine vessel but as a battlefield between purity and temptation. The very ecstasies that once opened the gates to heaven would now be condemned as invitations to hell. But in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, as Christianity grew, the old ways still held Rome in their grasp. Senators, soldiers, and commoners alike attended festivals of Bacchus and Venus, where sensuality was celebration and the fertility of the earth mirrored the fertility of the human body. Even the emperors themselves participated, sometimes publicly, often secretly, in rites that blurred the lines between religion and indulgence. The divine was not something to be prayed to from afar, but something to be tasted, touched, and embodied. The Church would come to call this the religion of flesh and ecstasy, a perversion of divine truth. Yet to the pagans, it was the very essence of existence, the belief that life itself was sacred, that the pulse of the heart was the drumbeat of creation. It was a world where sex was not shame but sacrament, where blood was not pollution but offering, and where the line between pleasure and holiness did not exist. And it was precisely this, the fusion of faith and flesh, that terrified the rising Christian order. For how could a religion of suffering compete with a religion of joy? How could a faith built on the rejection of the world survive beside one that celebrated it? To conquer the pagans, the Church would have to do more than ban their gods. It would have to redefine what it meant to be human. Before the fire of the cross could cleanse the empire, the old gods had to be made monstrous. Their beauty had to be recast as depravity, their rituals as corruption. The ecstatic union of man and divinity had to become the ultimate sin. And thus began the slow, deliberate process of erasure, not merely of temples and idols, but of memory itself. For the Romans once believed that to live was to worship. Every feast, every embrace, every wound, every drop of wine was an offering to the divine. And in the heartbeat of that vanished world, in the echo of drums, the glint of torchlight, and the cry of the ecstatic, lies the truth of why the Church feared these gods more than any other enemy. They did not merely offer faith. They offered freedom. Across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, faith was not confined to the marble grandeur of public temples. It thrived in the hidden chambers, in the subterranean halls and dimly lit sanctuaries where gods were worshipped not through words but through experience. These were the forbidden temples, places where the sacred mingled with the sensual, where the scent of burning myrrh and the sound of flutes awakened something ancient within the soul. They were the heart of Rome's spiritual underground, the last bastions of the old gods in a world about to be transformed by the cross. To walk through one of these temples was to step outside the boundaries of ordinary life. The air was thick with incense and heat. Torches flickered along walls painted with symbols of snakes, suns, and divine lovers entwined. At the center stood the altar, not a cold stone slab, but a living stage of transformation. Around it gathered men and women in linen robes, their faces illuminated by flame. There was no pulpit, no sermon, no hierarchy of power. There was only rhythm, the slow beating of drums, the rise of chants that blurred into a single pulse. Worship was not observation. It was participation. Among the most mysterious of these sanctuaries were the Mithraea, temples dedicated to Mithras, the Persian god of light, truth, and eternal struggle. They were built underground, shaped like caves to symbolize the cosmos itself. Only initiates could enter, and within these stone chambers, they enacted the sacred myth of the god's victory over the cosmic bull, a symbol of life, death, and rebirth. Candles burned in niches carved into the walls. Offerings of bread and wine were placed before the god's image, and oaths were sworn in blood. The initiates were soldiers, philosophers, and men of rank, bound by secrecy stronger than any military command. To them, Mithras was not a distant deity but a companion in the eternal battle between light and darkness. But while the Mithraic temples celebrated discipline and brotherhood, the rites of Bacchus and Cybele pulsed with something altogether more primal. In hidden groves and secluded villas, followers gathered at night for ceremonies that fused music, dance, and sensual abandon. The Bacchanalia, once tolerated by the Republic, had long been outlawed for their excess, yet they persisted, whispering through generations. They were said to dissolve the barriers of class and gender, allowing slaves and nobles alike to lose themselves in ecstatic union. In these moments of frenzy, the worshippers believed they were no longer human but divine, carried beyond reason into a state the Romans called divina furor, sacred madness. To outsiders, these rituals appeared as chaos, drunkenness, lust, and blasphemy. But to the participants, they were glimpses into a higher reality. Every gesture, every cry, every drop of sweat was symbolic, a reflection of the cosmic dance between creation and destruction. The mingling of bodies mirrored the merging of the earthly and the divine. Pleasure was not indulgence, it was revelation, a reminder that to feel deeply was to know the gods intimately. Even more enigmatic were the temples of Isis, whose cult had crossed from Egypt into Rome and captivated the hearts of both commoners and nobles. Her sanctuaries were filled with light, water, and song, a stark contrast to the bloody altars of older Roman gods. The worship of Isis offered comfort and personal salvation. Her followers underwent initiation rituals that mimicked death and resurrection, guided by priests in flowing white garments. They fasted, purified themselves in sacred water, and took part in symbolic dramas depicting the death and rebirth of Osiris. When the final moment of the ceremony came, the initiate stood before the statue of the goddess, eyes open to the flicker of sacred flame, and felt reborn. In these hidden temples, religion was not a doctrine but an experience, an encounter with the mysteries of existence. It was sensual, immediate, and alive. The gods were not distant judges but companions in suffering, joy, and passion. The rituals bound the community together through shared vulnerability and shared transcendence. The worshipper did not confess sin, they embodied divinity. But this world of living gods carried a danger, not to the people but to power. For when faith becomes intimate and direct, it no longer needs authority. The old temples empowered the individual to touch the sacred without mediation. No priest dictated the limits of devotion. No scripture confined the shape of truth. To the rising Christian hierarchy, this freedom was intolerable. The Church offered salvation through obedience, through belief in one God and one truth. The pagan cults offered 1,000 gods and 1,000 ways to find them. And so, as the Christian movement gained political strength, these temples became targets of moral outrage and state suppression. Preachers denounced them as brothels of the devil. Bishops warned that the ecstasies of Bacchus were snares of Satan, that the mysteries of Mithras were imitations of the Eucharist, twisted by demonic deceit. Imperial decrees began to close the temples, confiscate their treasures, and ban the gatherings that once defined Roman spirituality. Yet still, people came, quietly, secretly, drawn by the memory of the old god's touch. Picture the moment one of these temples fell. A crowd gathers as soldiers hammer down the doors of a Mithraeum hidden beneath the streets. They drag out the altars, topple the statue of Mithras slaying the bull, and throw it into the street. The flickering torches die out, leaving only the scent of extinguished incense and the echo of silence. The chamber that once symbolized the universe itself becomes a crypt. Above it, a new church will soon rise. The irony is almost poetic. The Christian rituals that replaced them, the sharing of bread and wine, the baptismal cleansing of sin, the promise of resurrection, mirrored the same ancient mysteries they condemned. The form changed, but the yearning remained. Humanity's desire to touch the divine through symbol, sacrifice, and ecstasy did not vanish. It was merely rebranded in new language. The Church absorbed what it could not destroy and buried the rest beneath layers of sanctity and shame. As Rome's skyline shifted from temples to basilicas, the city itself became a palimpsest, a sacred text rewritten over the ghosts of the old faiths. Beneath every cathedral lay the bones of a forgotten god, beneath every holy hymn the echo of a forbidden song. And somewhere, in the darkness of an unsealed crypt or a farmer's festival dance, fragments of those ancient rites still breathed. The Church could silence the worshippers, but not the human longing that had once filled those secret halls with song and fire. For in the forbidden temples of Rome, people did not simply pray. They became their prayers. And that was the most dangerous idea of all, that the divine might dwell not only above humanity, but within it. By the late 4th century, the Roman world had changed beyond recognition. The empire that had once celebrated 1,000 gods now bowed before one. The thunder of Jupiter was replaced by the tolling of church bells, and the laughter of baksheesh festivals gave way to the solemn hymns of the faithful. Yet this transformation did not happen through quiet conversion or peaceful persuasion. It was a war, not only for temples and territories, but for memory itself. The Church's greatest conquest was not the destruction of idols, but the rewriting of history. What could not be refuted was erased. What could not be destroyed was demonized. The campaign began subtly. As Christianity grew from a persecuted sect into the official religion of the empire, its leaders recognized that the old gods could not simply be ignored, they had to be replaced. The edicts of Emperor Constantine had legalized the faith, but his successors would sanctify its dominance through force. The turning point came with Emperor Theodosius I, who in 391 CE issued the Theodosian Decrees, a sweeping series of laws that outlawed pagan worship altogether. Overnight, centuries of tradition became criminal acts. Temples were confiscated, sacrifices forbidden, and any form of divination, even reading omens from birds, declared illegal. The decrees were more than political commands. They were instruments of spiritual conquest. In cities like Alexandria, Athens, and Rome, mobs stirred by bishops and Christian zealots descended upon the temples that had defined the classical world. The Serapeum of Alexandria, one of the grandest sanctuaries of the ancient world, became the stage for a brutal act of symbolic domination. Statues were smashed, scrolls burned, and the temple itself transformed into a Christian church. The god Serapis, once revered as the protector of Egypt, was declared a demon, his image dragged through the streets before being shattered by hammers. What had begun as religious reform soon became a systematic cleansing of culture. Pagan books were seized and burned, their knowledge labeled heretical or dangerous. Priests of the old cults were stripped of their status, their lands confiscated, their names forgotten. The rich mythology that had once bound the Roman world together, stories of gods who loved, suffered, and bled as humans did, was recast as satanic deception. And with each flame that consumed a scroll or each hammer that broke a statue, an entire worldview vanished from history. But the Church's war on paganism was not fought only with swords and fire. It was waged through language, through the slow rewriting of meaning itself. The festivals that once celebrated fertility and harvest were rebranded with new Christian significance. The springtime rites of renewal became Easter, tied to the resurrection of Christ. The winter solstice, when Romans had once honored Saturn with feasting and gifts, was transformed into Christmas, celebrating the birth of the Savior. The Church did not destroy every pagan custom. It absorbed them, reshaped them, and in doing so, robbed them of their original purpose. This was the brilliance of the Church's strategy. Rather than erase every trace of the old ways, it baptized them, turning gods into saints, rituals into sacraments, and myths into moral lessons. What could not be burned was repurposed. The goddess Diana became a faint echo in the figure of the Virgin Mary. The horned god of the forests was reborn as the image of Satan. Even the architecture of pagan temples was reclaimed. Marble columns, once dedicated to Venus or Apollo, were built into the walls of churches that stood upon the very foundations of their predecessors. To the casual believer, the transition might have seemed natural, almost seamless. The festivals continued, though their meanings had changed. Offerings were still made, candles still lit, prayers still whispered. Only now, the names of the gods had been replaced. Yet beneath this surface harmony lay a deeper act of psychological domination. The Church was not simply converting bodies, it was reshaping consciousness. The human relationship with the sacred, once embodied, sensual, and diverse, was redefined into something rigid, moralized, and centralized under ecclesiastical control. In monasteries and scriptoria, Christian scribes copied ancient texts, not to preserve them, but to censor them. Passages that described pagan rituals were deleted or corrected, with Christian commentary. Philosophers like Plato and Plotinus were reinterpreted through the lens of Christian theology, their ideas stripped of their mystical sensuality. Historians who dared to record the truth of the old religions faced persecution. By the time the Middle Ages began, the collective memory of pagan worship had been reduced to caricature, witches, orgies, and devil worship. The nuance, the philosophy, the deep symbolism of these ancient practices were lost beneath centuries of deliberate distortion. It was not merely destruction, it was narrative control. The Church understood that the most powerful way to conquer a civilization was not to erase its past, but to rewrite it. By controlling the story of what came before, it could control how people understood the present. The gods of the old world were not just exiled. They were vilified, recast as demons whispering temptation into the ears of the faithful. The serpent, once a symbol of wisdom and regeneration, became the embodiment of sin. The sacred feminine, once honored in every corner of the Mediterranean, was reduced to a shadow, holy only in chastity and submission. And yet, even as the Church celebrated its triumph, something persisted beneath the surface. The human heart does not forget easily. In the villages and countryside, far from the centers of power, peasants still celebrated the old festivals under new names. They still lit fires on midsummer nights, still danced at harvests, still whispered the names of the old gods in secret. The church could condemn, punish, and preach, but it could not extinguish the ancient hunger, the desire to feel the divine through the body, through the earth, through the rhythms of nature itself. The war on memory had been won in the records, but not in the soul. Beneath every Christian ritual lay the bones of a pagan one. Beneath every saint's story lay the ghost of a god or goddess long denied. And in the quiet corners of the empire, as monks penned sermons denouncing sin and idolatry, farmers and midwives continued to make offerings to the spirits of their ancestors, the old gods now wearing Christian masks. The church had succeeded in erasing paganism from official history. Yet in doing so, it preserved it in another form, hidden, distorted, and haunting. The temples had fallen, the scrolls had burned, but the longing that gave birth to them could not be destroyed. It waited beneath the surface of faith, buried but breathing, ready to return when the silence of history grew too deep. For in trying to erase the gods, the church did not kill them. It only changed their names. Even as the church's decrees outlawed the old gods and their sanctuaries fell to ruin, the rituals themselves refused to die. Across Europe's countryside, far from the eyes of bishops and emperors, fragments of pagan worship lived on, hidden within the rhythm of everyday life. What the church called superstition, the people called tradition. In the folds of peasant festivals, in the songs sung at harvest, in the secret prayers whispered by women at childbirth or over the sick, the ancient gods still breathed. The church had won its war on the temples, but it could not conquer the fields, the fires, or the flesh. The forbidden rituals of Rome survived, not as open faith, but as memory, echo, and disguise. The rural world of the early Middle Ages was a place where the sacred and the natural were one. Farmers marked the seasons not by scripture, but by the movement of the sun, the sprouting of crops, and the phases of the moon. Each cycle was honored through ritual, a remnant of Rome's ancient festivals. In spring, people celebrated fertility and renewal with garlands, dancing, and bonfires, traditions that had once belonged to Venus and Flora. In summer, they gathered to honor the solstice with feasts and torchlit processions. In autumn, they gave thanks for the harvest, pouring wine upon the ground as an offering to the earth. The church would eventually rename these celebrations as the Feasts of Saints, St. John's Eve, Michaelmas, All Hallows, but the gestures, the emotions, the hidden meanings remained pagan at their core. One of the most enduring survivals of these forbidden rites was the maypole, a towering wooden pole erected in the center of the village, adorned with ribbons and flowers. Men and women danced around it in spiraling patterns that symbolized the union of male and female, sky and earth, life and creation. The church saw in this dance an echo of ancient fertility worship and condemned it as indecent. Yet it could not stop the people from celebrating. Year after year, the maypole rose again, a silent rebellion disguised as joy. In other regions, echoes of the old mystery rites survived in the carnival, the festival of inversion that preceded Lent. For a few days each year, the world turned upside down, peasants became kings, priests were mocked, and every forbidden pleasure was indulged before the season of denial began. Beneath the laughter and masquerade lingered the memory of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy. The carnival was a ritual of chaos, a remnant of Rome's Dionysian festivals that refused to vanish, even as the church tried to tame it by enclosing it within the Christian calendar. Other customs were darker, more secretive. In remote valleys and mountain villages, people still lit fires on hilltops during solstices, ancient symbols of purification and rebirth. Livestock were driven through smoke for protection, children jumped over flames to ensure health and fertility. These were remnants of the fire rites once performed for gods like Vulcan and Vesta, now cloaked as blessings in honor of Christian saints. Even the bonfires of St. John's Eve, officially meant to celebrate the birth of John the Baptist, carried unmistakably pagan roots. The church tolerated them publicly, but in private writings, priests warned that demons danced in the flames. The persistence of these customs reveals a simple truth: people did not forget what made them feel alive. The sensuality of pagan ritual, its celebration of body, nature, and rhythm, spoke to something primal that the austere doctrines of the Church could never replace. When the Church told the faithful to reject the flesh, they instead baptized their pleasures under new names. When priests forbade songs of the harvest, the people sang hymns to saints that sounded suspiciously like invocations to Ceres or Bacchus. Nowhere was this survival more visible than in the rites of women. The Church's hierarchy was male, but the remnants of the old religion were guarded by women, mothers, midwives, and wise healers who carried fragments of ancient knowledge passed down through generations. They blessed seeds before planting, mixed herbs for childbirth, and whispered prayers to protect infants from illness. In their words lingered the memory of goddesses long condemned: Isis, Diana, Cybele, reborn as nameless protectors of hearth and home. To the Church, these women were dangerous, not because they worshipped openly, but because they remembered. By the 12th century, Church authorities had begun to notice these survivals and launched new campaigns to root them out. Priests wrote manuals warning against pagan superstitions and the old customs of the country folk. Bishops traveled through rural parishes demanding the destruction of charms, idols, and sacred groves. Yet the more they tried to suppress these practices, the more they transformed, slipping deeper into secrecy, blending ever more seamlessly into Christian life. The old rites became invisible, yet omnipresent, surviving in gestures, blessings, and songs that no law could erase. In many regions, the forbidden rituals took on darker tones. By the late Middle Ages, the Church began to associate them with witchcraft, the imagined worship of the devil. The witches' Sabbath, as described by inquisitors, was a grotesque parody of ancient fertility feasts, night gatherings in fields, ecstatic dances, feasting, and carnal unions with spirits. Historians now understand that many of these confessions were extracted under torture, shaped by Church fantasies and fear. Yet beneath the myth of the witches' Sabbath lies the shadow of something older, the survival of rites once performed for the gods of earth and sky. Even the Church's calendar itself bore traces of the world it had tried to erase. Every holy day mirrored an ancient feast. The celebration of saints at wells and springs recalled the worship of water deities. The processions of relics resembled the ancient parades of idols. The lighting of candles before images of saints echoed the offerings once made to household gods. What had been condemned as idolatry in one age became devotion in the next, proving that memory, though altered, never truly dies. In this strange blend of faith and defiance, Europe lived for centuries with two religions, one public, one private. One preached from the pulpit, the other whispered in the fields. Christianity ruled by doctrine, but paganism endured through instinct. The people may have called upon Christ and Mary, but in their gestures, in their songs, in their secret rites of birth, love, and death, the old gods continued to move. The Church's scholars could write, and the Church's armies could destroy, but the soil itself remembered. Every spring that bubbled from the earth, every stone circle that cast its shadow on the solstice, every fire lit at midsummer carried the faint heartbeat of Rome's forbidden rituals. In those flickering lights and whispered songs, humanity's oldest truth endured, that the divine is not confined to heaven or scripture, but lives in the blood, the earth, and the endless rhythm of life. The forbidden rites had not been eradicated. They had simply learned to hide in plain sight, behind every saint's name, beneath every churchyard festival, and within every heart that still longed to touch the sacred in the warmth of the world. What the Church believed it had erased, the people carried forward, not in defiance but in remembrance. And so, through centuries of silence, the ancient gods remained, not as idols, but as echoes, pulsing softly beneath the skin of Christian Europe. By the late Middle Ages, a strange transformation had taken place within the very heart of the Christian world. The Church that had once condemned the sensual, the earthly, and the ecstatic began to absorb fragments of the pagan world it had destroyed. It did so quietly, often without admitting it, wrapping the ancient in the robes of the sacred. The result was something haunting, a faith that preached salvation through suffering but still burned with the same hunger for ritual, purification, and transcendence that had once defined the old Roman cults. What had been forbidden now returned in a new form, baptized by fire and sanctified by blood. In the great cathedrals of medieval Europe, you can still feel it, that fusion of two worlds. The architecture itself, rising toward the heavens with impossible grace, mirrored the ancient temples of Rome, where stone and sky met in divine geometry. But beyond the design, there was something deeper. Every cathedral was built over older foundations, Roman shrines, pagan groves, sacred wells. The church had learned to purify the land not by erasing its power, but by claiming it. To build a cathedral over a pagan temple was not destruction, it was transformation. The stones still held memory, and the rituals that took place within them were not as different as they appeared. The theme of fire and purification that had once dominated pagan rites now became a central metaphor for Christian salvation. The fires that had once burned in honor of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, were reborn as the candles of the altar. The smoke of sacrifice became the incense that filled the nave, rising to heaven like prayers. Even the act of consuming the body and blood in the Eucharist, the holiest of Christian sacraments, echoed the ancient mysteries of Dionysus and Mithras, where followers symbolically partook in the flesh of the god to share his divine essence. The Church would have denied such comparisons, yet the parallels are impossible to ignore. One of the most striking survivals of pagan purification was the ritual of the holy fire. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins tended an eternal flame that symbolized the life of the city. When Christianity rose, the cult of Vesta was abolished, but centuries later, the same idea reappeared in Easter ceremonies. Each spring, the church would extinguish every light in the cathedral, plunging it into darkness, the symbol of sin and death. Then, from a single spark, a new fire was lit, the Lumen Christi, the light of Christ. That flame would be carried throughout the church, igniting candles in the hands of the faithful until the darkness vanished. What had once been the sacred fire of the goddess became the holy light of the Savior, reborn, renamed, but never forgotten. Yet this absorption of pagan symbolism came with a darker cost. The church's obsession with purity, of soul, of body, of belief, became increasingly extreme. Where pagan rituals had sought balance with nature, Christian purification demanded submission. The sensual fire of the old gods became the purgatorial fire of punishment. Pain was no longer a gateway to ecstasy but a path to repentance. The human body, once celebrated in pagan art and ritual, became a site of sin to be mortified. In monasteries, monks whipped themselves bloody in imitation of Christ's suffering. Women were told their beauty was a temptation, their desire a curse. What had once been sacred pleasure was now rebranded as holy pain. This new theology of fire and ice, purification through agony, salvation through self-denial, found its most terrifying expression in the Church's treatment of heresy. The medieval inquisitors, acting in the name of faith, turned fire into an instrument of cleansing. The burning of heretics was justified as a means to save their souls, to purge the corruption of sin through flame. In their minds, they were not executing sinners, they were baptizing them with the purest element. To die by fire was, in their twisted logic, an act of divine mercy. At the same time, the Church's teachings on the afterlife evolved to include a new realm, purgatory, a place not of eternal damnation but of cleansing suffering. It was the spiritual echo of the old rites of purification, now projected into eternity. The dead were imagined to pass through fire to be made worthy of heaven. This concept, though clothed in Christian theology, drew heavily from ancient mystery religions, which had long taught that the soul must endure trials before achieving divine union. Once again, what had been pagan doctrine was reborn as Christian truth. But while the Church sanctified fire, it also came to fear it. Every flicker of the old world seemed to glow with diabolic light. When peasants lit bonfires at midsummer, the clergy saw witchcraft. When women burned herbs to heal, the Church smelled heresy. Fire, once the symbol of the divine, became the mark of the infernal. In this inversion lay the ultimate tragedy of the Church's conquest over paganism. The sacred forces that had once connected humanity to nature were now seen as threats, to be hunted, tortured, and destroyed. And yet, even amid the flames of persecution, the old meaning of fire refused to die. Among the people, the midsummer bonfire remained a symbol of renewal and protection. Lovers leapt over it for luck. Families carried its ashes to bless their fields. The church might have redefined fire as punishment, but the people still felt its warmth as life. It was as if Europe lived between two fires, one of fear, one of faith. One burned to purify sin, the other to celebrate creation. Ice, too, held its own symbolism within this duality. In the far north, where Christianity spread among the remnants of Norse and Celtic traditions, cold was seen as a divine test. Monks and hermits sought isolation in icy caves, believing the freezing of the body could cleanse the soul. Pilgrims crawled barefoot through snow as acts of penance. The frozen landscapes of northern monasteries became living metaphors for spiritual discipline, an inversion of the Mediterranean cults of fire and fertility. Where Rome had worshipped warmth and life, the Church of the North sanctified chill and suffering. In both fire and ice, the Church recreated the dual essence of the pagan world: purification through extremes, rebirth through endurance. What had once been ritual became doctrine. What had once been ecstasy became penitence. And yet, at the heart of it all, the same hunger endured: the yearning for transformation, for transcendence, for a glimpse of the divine within the human. This paradox gave medieval Christianity its haunting beauty. Its art, music, and architecture all shimmered with the tension between passion and restraint, sin and salvation. The flickering candles before the saints, the incense curling like smoke from ancient altars, the chants that rose and fell like pagan invocations, all carried traces of the forbidden past. The Church had destroyed the temples, but in doing so, it had unknowingly rebuilt them within itself. Fire and ice, purity and desire, condemnation and rebirth. These forces had once belonged to Rome's forbidden rituals, but now they pulsed through the heart of Christian Europe. The Church may have claimed to erase paganism, yet in every cathedral flame and monastic frost, it was reborn, not as heresy, but as holiness. The divine had changed its face, but its essence, the eternal rhythm of destruction and renewal, remained untouched. The world had only learned to call it by another name. As the centuries unfolded and the medieval world matured into the high age of Christendom, a strange and unsettling truth became clear: the Church had not truly destroyed the pagan gods. It had transformed them. Buried beneath the marble saints and gilded altars, the gods of the old world had merely changed their masks. The Church had inherited their domains, their symbols, their powers, even their fears, and reshaped them into the faces of angels and demons. What had once been worshipped as divine now lingered as monstrous, and what had been condemned as blasphemous became sanctified. This was the final metamorphosis of Rome's forbidden rituals, the ancient deities reborn within the mythic imagination of Christian Europe, both feared and adored, both banished and preserved. Nowhere was this transformation more vivid than in the creation of Christian saints. The early Church, desperate to replace the countless gods of Rome with its own spiritual hierarchy, found itself crafting new figures that mirrored the roles once filled by the old pantheon. The result was a tapestry of divine intercessors who bore uncanny resemblances to their pagan predecessors. Saint George, the dragon slayer, echoed the heroic deeds of Perseus and Mithras. Saint Bridget of Ireland carried the attributes of the Celtic goddess Brigid, guardian of fertility, poetry, and fire. Even the Virgin Mary absorbed the grace and majesty once given to Isis, Cybele, and Venus, becoming the compassionate mother whose image replaced theirs across the Mediterranean world. To the common people, this change felt seamless. They did not see contradiction, they saw continuity. Where once they had prayed to Diana for safe childbirth, they now prayed to the Virgin. Where they had once called upon Neptune for calm seas, they lit candles before Saint Nicholas, patron of sailors. The names had changed, but the rituals, the offerings, the gestures, the faith remained the same. The Church, in its cunning, had realized something profound. The human soul could not be stripped of its symbols. It could only be guided toward new interpretations of the same ancient truths. But not every god could be redeemed. For every pagan deity that became a saint, another was condemned to hell. The pantheon of Olympus and the spirits of Rome's mystery cults were recast as the demons of Christian theology, fallen angels who whispered temptation and chaos into the world. Pan, once the playful god of the wild, was transformed into the very image of Satan, horns, hooves, and all. The forest spirits, once protectors of fertility and nature, became devils lurking in shadows. The gods of wisdom and desire were rebranded as corruptors of faith. Through this inversion, the Church achieved something psychologically powerful. It forced the human mind to divide what had once been whole. Nature itself became a moral battlefield, its forces split between heaven and hell. This transformation reflected a deeper psychological war within the human spirit. The Church sought to conquer not only the outer world of temples and idols but also the inner world of emotion and instinct. In doing so, it turned the cosmic balance of the old religions, life and death, love and terror, chaos and order, into moral opposites. The gods who had once embodied both creation and destruction were now split in two. The angels became pure, radiant, sterile. The demons became dark, carnal, alive. The same archetypes persisted, but their meanings were inverted. Humanity's shadow, once honored through ritual, was now exiled to the realm of sin. In this new spiritual order, suffering became the bridge between man and the divine. Just as the pagan initiates had endured trials of fire, blood, or isolation to achieve enlightenment, Christians were taught to embrace suffering as a path to salvation. The saints who replaced the old gods were not mighty warriors or sensual lovers but martyrs, men and women who found holiness through pain. Their bodies became the new altars, their wounds the new symbols of transcendence. In their agony, the Church found both power and poetry. The pagan gods had demanded offerings. The Christian God demanded endurance. Yet beneath this glorification of pain, the echoes of ancient heroism still lingered. The legends of saints often mirrored the epic cycles of pagan mythology. Saint Michael's battle with the dragon recalled Zeus's war with the Titans. Saint Sebastian's death by arrows evoked the martyrdom of Adonis, pierced and resurrected. Even Christ himself, the dying and resurrected Savior, carried within him the eternal pattern of Osiris, Mithras, and Dionysus, gods who had died to renew the world. The Church had claimed to erase myth, yet its central story was the greatest myth of all, the God who suffers, dies, and returns, bearing light from the underworld. In this synthesis, the Church became the custodian of the very mysteries it had forbidden. The Mass, with its symbolic consumption of flesh and blood, mirrored the ancient rites of communion that had once belonged to Bacchus and Attis. The chants of monks, rising and falling in endless repetition, recalled the hymns sung in the temples of Cybele. Even the relics of saints, bones, hair, and blood, were revered as the pagan world had once revered the remains of heroes. Each fragment was believed to hold power, to bridge the gap between the living and the divine. The Church, in suppressing paganism, had absorbed its essence, and in doing so, became something mythic itself. But there was another transformation, darker and more personal. As the Church redefined the divine, it also redefined the human soul. Paganism had taught that divinity lived within nature and within the body. Christianity taught that it dwelled above and beyond, in the unreachable realm of heaven. The sacred was no longer something to be touched, tasted, or seen, it was something to suffer for. This shift tore humanity from its sensual roots. The earth, once holy, became corrupt. Desire, once divine, became sin. The pagan gods had celebrated human nature, the Christian God demanded its denial. And yet, paradoxically, this very repression gave birth to new forms of spiritual intensity. In monasteries, mystics sought union with God through ecstatic visions, experiences that mirrored the trance states of ancient initiates. In their writings, they spoke of divine rapture, burning love, and even spiritual marriage, imagery that revealed how deeply the forbidden still pulsed beneath Christian devotion. The mystic's ecstasy was the ancient dance of Dionysus reborn within the confines of faith. The body was denied, yet it still trembled with divine longing. By the time the Renaissance dawned, the old gods began to stir once more. Artists, scholars, and poets rediscovered the texts that the Church had hidden for centuries. The faces of Apollo, Venus, and Pan reappeared in marble and paint, their beauty no longer seen as blasphemous but as expressions of divine creation. The Church tried to contain this resurgence, but the world had changed. Humanity was beginning to remember what it had once been, not a fallen creature begging for mercy, but a being capable of glory, ecstasy, and creation. The gods that Christianity had buried were not dead. They had simply waited beneath the surface, whispering through art, through dreams, through the silent persistence of desire. Thus, in the long arc of history, the Church became both the destroyer and the preserver of the old religion. It erased the names of the gods but carried their essence forward, embedding them within its saints, its demons, and its rituals. The forbidden had been conquered, yet it was never gone. The world had only learned to speak its language in another tongue. And within every flicker of candlelight, every prayer of the penitent, and every cry of the mystic, the old gods still listened, not as rivals to Christ, but as eternal echoes of humanity's need to find the divine within itself. The Roman Church had believed it had silenced the pagan world forever. But in truth, it had become its final, most elaborate expression, a cathedral built upon the bones of forgotten temples, where the same ancient fire still burned, hidden behind the face of heaven. By the twilight of the medieval world, Europe stood as a monument to contradiction. Its cathedrals rose like mountains of faith, yet beneath their stones lay the graves of forgotten gods. Its priests preached salvation and purity, yet its history was soaked in blood, persecution, and fear. The Roman Church had triumphed. It had erased the names of the old gods, rewritten the calendar of the seasons, and sanctified the empire's authority in the name of heaven. But in doing so, it had also unleashed something far darker, a faith that demanded cruelty to preserve its purity, a morality that turned suffering into holiness, and a vision of the divine that justified destruction in the name of salvation. This was the age when mercy itself began to die. What had once been the sensual, cyclical world of pagan ritual, life and death intertwined in eternal balance, was now divided into absolute opposites, heaven and hell, good and evil, sin and virtue. The Church no longer saw transgression as part of nature, it saw it as rebellion against God. In the old world, blood had been shed in offerings to ensure fertility, abundance, or cosmic harmony. In the new world, blood was shed to destroy heresy and purify the soul. The act remained the same, only the justification changed. And so, from the ashes of Rome's temples arose an empire of sanctified cruelty. The Inquisition became the Church's sword, a machine built to extract purity from flesh. It was not born of sadism, but of belief. The inquisitors saw themselves not as torturers, but as physicians of the soul. Pain, they claimed, revealed truth. The scream of the accused was the sound of the devil fleeing the body. To purge sin through agony was an act of love. In their twisted theology, cruelty became compassion, and thus, the very virtues of mercy and salvation were weaponized against humanity itself. The instruments of this new faith were as diverse as they were horrifying. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the strappado, all invented not for vengeance, but for revelation. To suffer was to confess was to be saved. This was not punishment in the Roman sense of justice, nor the pagan sense of balance. It was purification by pain, sanctified by divine logic. The same fires that had once honored Vesta now consumed heretics in the town square. The same chants that had once praised Dionysus now echoed through torture chambers disguised as prayers. But cruelty was not confined to the dungeon. It had become embedded in the very fabric of faith. Monks fasted until they hallucinated, flagellants marched through cities whipping themselves to atone for the sins of the world, and preachers declared that pleasure itself was the whisper of the devil. The Church had transformed the ancient human longing for union with the divine, once expressed through ecstasy and creation, into a longing for annihilation. To destroy the self became the highest form of worship. It was during this time that art and theology began to merge into a theater of suffering. Paintings of Christ no longer showed a serene Savior but a body twisted in agony, bleeding beneath the crown of thorns. Saints were depicted pierced, burned, and broken, their pain transfigured into beauty. The Church had learned what the ancient Romans and pagans already knew: spectacle moves the soul. But now, that spectacle had turned inward. The eroticism of pain replaced the sensuality of life. Devotion became voyeurism, faith became fascination with death. In this world of sanctified agony, the very concept of mercy was inverted. Where once mercy meant compassion, it now meant obedience. The Church offered forgiveness, but only after absolute submission. Questioning faith became treason against God. Desire became rebellion against order. And those who resisted, the mystics, the healers, the philosophers, the heretics, were branded as agents of darkness. The same spirit of curiosity that had built the temples of Rome was now declared a sin. Knowledge became dangerous. Pleasure became blasphemy. The body became the enemy. And yet, the forbidden kept returning, not in the open rituals of the old gods, but in the secret recesses of Christian devotion. The same monks who condemned lust wrote poems that trembled with erotic longing for the divine. The same nuns who vowed chastity described mystical ecstasies that mirrored the rites of Venus. The language of sin became indistinguishable from the language of desire. The Church had tried to kill the old gods, but it had only driven them deeper, into the flesh, into the imagination, into the heart of faith itself. This tension exploded in the Renaissance, the Church's greatest triumph and its undoing. Artists and thinkers began to reclaim what the Church had buried: the beauty of the body, the holiness of reason, the divinity of nature. Michelangelo's David was not a saint, he was a pagan hero reborn. Botticelli's Venus rose from the sea, unashamed, radiant, alive. The forbidden spirit of the ancient world was awakening, clothed in Christian symbols but pulsing with pre-Christian fire. The Church tolerated it for a time, as long as it served its glory, but it could not control the tide forever. As knowledge spread, so too did doubt. The Church's monopoly on truth began to crumble, and with it, the old logic of divine cruelty. The same fire that had burned heretics now threatened to consume its keepers. Men like Giordano Bruno, who dared to see the divine in the infinite universe, much like the Stoics and Neoplatonists of Rome, were executed not for evil, but for seeing too much. His death marked the final echo of the Church's war against the pagan spirit, the punishment of curiosity, the destruction of wonder. Yet, in a cruel irony, the Church's own obsession with suffering gave birth to something profoundly human. In its relentless pursuit of purity, it forced humanity to confront the limits of faith, the meaning of mercy, and the cost of redemption. It made the world ask, can cruelty ever be holy? Can salvation ever justify pain? In this moral tension, the seeds of modern compassion were sown. The same institution that had once burned in the name of love would one day preach the sanctity of forgiveness. But in the centuries that followed, the shadow of its cruelty remained. The memory of the stake, the dungeon, and the whip haunted Europe's conscience. Even as science, reason, and art reclaimed the world, the echo of those screams lingered, a reminder that beneath civilization's piety lies the instinct to destroy what it fears. The Roman Church had inherited the grandeur of empire and the mystery of pagan ritual, but it had fused them into something far more potent, a faith that turned suffering into virtue. This was the death of mercy, not as compassion, but as innocence. Humanity had learned to sanctify pain, to make horror divine. And in doing so, it revealed the darkest truth of all, that the line between salvation and damnation is not drawn in heaven, but in the human heart. The Church may have believed it had cleansed the world of pagan corruption. Yet, in the end, it had merely mirrored it, transforming the sacred cruelty of the old gods into its own. The temples of Rome had fallen, but their spirit lived on, cloaked in crosses and candles, whispering through every sermon that demanded faith through fear. And so, as the fires of the Inquisition dimmed and the Renaissance dawned, Europe was left standing in the twilight between two worlds, one of faith, one of instinct, both forever bound by the same forbidden truth, that the divine and the cruel have always been one, that the Church believed it had silenced the pagan world, yet the old gods never truly died. Their fire persisted, hidden beneath saints, rituals, and cathedral walls. Every candle, Every festival, every whispered prayer carried fragments of forbidden rites. What was erased in name survived in essence. A secret pulse of desire, awe, and transcendence. Humanity's longing for the divine could not be controlled, only redirected. The temples fell, idols shattered, but the sacred endured. In every shadow, in every echo of faith, the forbidden whispers still move through history, reminding us that what is erased can never truly be forgotten.